There is a net lying on a beach in Galilee. It is still wet. Salt water drips off the edge of it onto sand that has not yet warmed in the morning sun, and two brothers are kneeling beside it, folding it the way they have folded it 1,000 mornings before this one. They smell like fish. Their hands are cracked from rope and brine. Nothing about this morning feels different from any other morning. And in about 60 seconds, everything about their lives is going to change forever. You are standing on that beach. Picture it. The Sea of Galilee at sunrise. Not blue, more like hammered pewter, with mist still sitting low on the water. Fishing boats pulled up on the shore. The smell of smoke from a dozen small breakfast fires. And a man walking along the edge of the water, alone, not in any hurry, looking at the faces of ordinary men, the way you might look at a map you've been waiting your whole life to read. This is not a story about 13 men in robes standing behind Jesus in a painting, looking serene and certain and a little bit bored. Forget that image. Burn it down. This is not a story about distant holy men whose lives have nothing to do with yours. And this is not a story about people who were born special, chosen because they were somehow different from you. What you're about to hear is the opposite of all of that. These were fishermen, a tax collector everyone in town despised, a man nicknamed for his temper, a man who doubted out loud in front of everyone and never apologized for it. 12 men hand-picked by Jesus, and almost none of them were the kind of men anyone would have picked. Here's where this gets remarkable. By the end of this video, you're going to watch that wet net on the beach turn into something else entirely. You're going to follow these 12 men out from this shoreline, across the Roman Empire, into Persia, into Armenia, all the way to the edge of the known world. And one of them, you're going to find, ends up buried on the far side of the earth, in a tomb so far from this beach that the men standing here this morning couldn't have named the country it's in. But that's the end of the story. Right now, it's just a beach, a net. Brothers named Simon and Andrew, mending rope, with no idea that a man is walking toward them who is about to ask them to leave everything they have ever known. He stops. He says 4 words. "Follow me," Jesus says. Matthew's gospel records what happens next in a single sentence. They dropped their nets and they followed him. Immediately. No negotiation, no going home to think about it. The Greek word used here is eutheos. It means at once, with a sense of urgency, almost violence, to the timing. One moment they are fishermen. The next moment they are something the world has never seen before. Apostles. The word apostolos in Greek doesn't mean follower. It means one who is sent. A messenger carrying the authority of the one who sent him. 12 men. 12 different stories. And 12 different endings. Some of them so strange, so far-flung, so soaked in blood that you'll wonder how a movement built on men like this ever survived its first decade. Stay with me, because the man who picked them knew exactly what he was doing. Let's start with the brothers on the beach, because their story is the story everyone else's story gets measured against. Simon, the one Jesus will later rename Peter, and his brother Andrew were partners in a fishing business on the Sea of Galilee, working alongside another set of brothers, James and John, sons of a man named Zebedee. This wasn't a glamorous trade. Galilean fishermen worked at night, hauled nets by hand, gutted and salted fish before dawn, and paid taxes on their catch to Roman-appointed officials who took their cut before the fishermen ever saw a coin. Peter was almost certainly married. Mark's gospel mentions his mother-in-law, which means when he dropped his net, he wasn't just walking away from a job. He was walking away from a household that depended on him, and he did it anyway. Immediately, Matthew's gospel says, no severance package, no notice period, just a wet net left on the sand and a man walking after a stranger. Here's what most people miss about Peter. He is, by a wide margin, the most embarrassing person in the entire New Testament. He's the one who tries to walk on water and sinks. He's the one who pulls out a sword in the garden and cuts off a man's ear. and Jesus has to heal the damage Peter just caused. He's the one who swears, 3 times with curses. Mark's gospel says that he has never even met Jesus, while Jesus is being tried a few hundred feet away. If you were casting the lead character for Foundation of the Church, Peter would not make the first round of auditions. And that's the point. That's the whole point. Now, picture 2 more men on that same beach, James and John, sons of Zebedee. Jesus gave them a nickname that tells you everything: Boanerges, sons of thunder. In one gospel account, these 2 brothers actually ask Jesus if he wants them to call down fire from heaven to destroy a village that refused to welcome him. Fire from heaven on a village. That's who these men were before Jesus got hold of them. Hot-tempered, ambitious, the kind of brothers who once asked Jesus, point blank, if they could have the seats of highest honor when he came into his glory. Sons of thunder. And yet one of them, John, is the same man who, by the end of his life, is remembered as the apostle of love, the one who wrote that God is love, who leaned against Jesus at the Last Supper like a son leaning against a father. Thunder doesn't disappear, but it can be redirected. Now, here's the one that should really stop you. Sitting in a tax booth in Capernaum, collecting money from his own neighbors on behalf of Rome, was a man named Matthew, also called Levi. You need to understand what that job meant. Tax collectors in first-century Judea weren't just unpopular. They were considered traitors, collaborators. A Jewish man who worked for Rome, taxing his own people, was lumped in with prostitutes and criminals in the public imagination. The Gospels themselves use the phrase tax collectors and sinners, so often it's almost one word. The Greek word for his old job, telones, carried the smell of betrayal with it. And Jesus walks up to that booth, in front of everyone, and says the same 2 words he said to the fishermen. Follow me. Matthew got up, left the booth, left the money sitting there, presumably, and followed him. No questions asked, the text says. A man the whole town considered a thief and a sellout becomes one of the 12 men entrusted with writing down the story of the Messiah. One of the 4 Gospels carries his name to this day. Fisherman, a man nicknamed for wanting to burn down a village, a tax collector everyone despised. This is who Jesus built his church on. So here's the pattern. 12 men. Not one of them was a religious professional. Not one of them had credentials, training, or a resume that would have gotten them in the door of any synagogue leadership position in Jerusalem. Fishermen, a tax collector, a zealot, a doubter, ordinary men, flawed men, in some cases despised men, and Jesus looked at every one of them and said 2 words, "Follow me." And every single one of them said yes. Now, before we go further, because what happens to these 12 men gets a lot heavier from here, I want to ask you something. Of the 12 apostles, 2 of the most surprising calls were Matthew, the tax collector everyone hated, and Simon the Zealot, a man whose political party literally wanted to violently overthrow Rome. 2 men from opposite ends of the social and political spectrum, both sitting at the same table with Jesus for 3 years. Which one of those callings surprises you more? If it's Matthew the tax collector, drop a 1 in the comments. If it's Simon the Zealot, drop a 2. I read every single one, and I want to know what you think before we keep going. Because here's what's coming. These 12 men didn't just follow Jesus for 3 years and then quietly retire. After the resurrection, after Pentecost, something happens to this group of fishermen and tax collectors and zealots that should not have been possible. They scatter. Not to nearby towns, not even to nearby countries. According to the earliest church traditions, preserved by historians like Eusebius of Caesarea, writing in the 4th century, these 12 men ended up carrying their message to Rome, to Greece, to Armenia, to Persia, and according to some of the oldest traditions in Christianity, all the way to India. Think about the logistics of that for 1 second. No printing press, no roads guaranteed safe, no translators waiting for them. Just 12 men, most of them never having traveled more than a few days' walk from Galilee in their entire lives, walking out in different directions into the most powerful and most dangerous empire on earth, carrying a story about a man who had been executed as a criminal. And here's the part nobody tells you in Sunday school. Almost every single one of them dies for it. Not all in the same way, not all at the same time. Some of these deaths are recorded plainly in the Bible. Most of them are not. They come down to us through later church tradition, through historians, through the kind of evidence that isn't a courtroom transcript, but isn't nothing either. And taken together, these 12 endings tell you something the Gospels alone can't quite tell you. What it actually cost to be the first people on earth who believed Jesus rose from the dead. We're going to go through them, one by one. And we're going to end with the one whose body crossed an ocean. Let's start with the one whose death the Bible actually tells us about directly. James, the son of Zebedee, one of those sons of thunder we talked about, becomes the first of the 12 to die. The book of Acts records it in 2 short verses. King Herod Agrippa I, looking to score points with religious leaders in Jerusalem, arrests several members of the church and has James killed with the sword. That's it. That's the whole account. No long trial. No dramatic speech. A king decides one apostle's death will buy him some political goodwill, and James, one of the inner circle, one of the 3 men closest to Jesus during his ministry, is gone. Beheaded, almost certainly, since that was the standard method for execution by sword under Roman-influenced law. This happens around 14 years after the resurrection. The thunder that once wanted to call down fire on a village is silenced by a sword in Jerusalem. And the book of Acts moves on to the next verse like it's reporting the weather. But it gets stranger from here, because most of what happens to the others doesn't come from Acts at all. It comes from tradition. And tradition says Andrew, Peter's brother, the first man, according to John's Gospel, to actually go find Jesus and bring his brother to meet him, eventually made his way to Greece. He preached in the region of Patras on the southern coast, and according to the tradition that's been passed down for nearly 2,000 years, he was crucified there. Not on a standard Roman cross, but on one shaped like an X, what later becomes known as the St. Andrew's cross, the same shape you'll find today on the flag of Scotland, a country Andrew never visited, but which adopted him as a patron saint centuries later because of a story about a cross on a beach in Greece. 2 brothers, both fishermen, both called on the same morning on the same beach, one beheaded in Jerusalem in his 40s, one crucified on a foreign coast, decades later, on a cross shaped like his own name. Now, here's one that should genuinely surprise you. You remember Thomas? Doubting Thomas, the guy who refused to believe the resurrection until he could put his own finger in the wounds. Before that moment, though, there's a scene people skip past completely. Earlier in John's Gospel, when Jesus says he's going back toward Jerusalem, toward almost certain danger, it's Thomas who turns to the other disciples and says, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Not, "Let's talk him out of it." Not, "Let's stay here where it's safe." Thomas, the doubter, is also the one who's ready to die alongside Jesus before any of the others say a word. And according to one of the oldest and most geographically specific traditions about any of the apostles, preserved by Eusebius and developed further in later writings, Thomas didn't just preach nearby. He went east, through Parthia, through what's now Iran, and according to a tradition that Christians in India have preserved for nearly 2,000 years, all the way to the southwestern coast of India. There's a community there today, Christians who trace their roots back to the 1st century, who call themselves the Thomas Christians, and they will tell you their faith didn't arrive through European missionaries centuries later. It arrived with one of the original 12. Before we go further, if you're finding this as wild as I did when I first dug into it, hit that like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe. Because we've got two more endings coming that are even harder to believe. And if you know someone who'd want to see where all 12 of these men ended up, this is a good one to send them. Hold that thought on Thomas, because where his story ends is where this whole video is going to end. Now we come to Peter. And if you've been paying attention, you already know Peter doesn't deserve a clean ending, except that's exactly what he gets, in a way nobody expected, including Peter himself. Remember what we said about Peter? Impulsive, embarrassing, the man who denied even knowing Jesus 3 times in one night, with curses, while Jesus stood on trial close enough to hear him say it. After the resurrection, there's a quiet scene on a beach, another morning, almost a mirror of where this whole story started, where Jesus asks Peter the same question 3 times. Do you love me? 3 denials, 3 questions. And then Jesus tells him something strange. He says that when Peter is young, he goes where he wants. But when he is old, others will dress him and lead him where he does not want to go. John's Gospel adds a quiet note. Jesus said this to show the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. That's about as close as Scripture gets to telling us how Peter dies. For the rest, we rely on tradition, but it's some of the strongest tradition we have for any of the 12. Early Christian writers, including Clement of Rome, writing within decades of the events, place Peter's death in Rome, under the Emperor Nero, somewhere around the year 64. And one detail has been repeated for almost 2,000 years, that Peter was crucified upside down. Not because the Romans were being merciful. According to the tradition recorded by the early writer Origen, it was Peter himself who asked for it, because he felt he wasn't worthy to die in the same position as Jesus. Think about that. The man who once denied Jesus 3 times in a single night, out of fear, ends his life nailed to a cross, by his own request, upside down, because even in death, he didn't want to be compared to the one he had once been too afraid to claim. Now contrast that with John. Out of all 12, John is the only one tradition says died of natural causes, in old age, in the city of Ephesus, somewhere around the end of the 1st century, nearly 70 years after that morning on the beach. But natural causes doesn't mean John's story is quiet. At one point, Roman authorities exile him to a atoll, rocky island in the Aegean Sea called Patmos. And it's there, alone, an old man on a barren island, that John has the vision that becomes the book of Revelation. The same man, once nicknamed Son of Thunder, spends his final years writing about a voice like thunder and a throne and a city coming down out of heaven. And now, here's where we come back to where we started. Remember the net on the beach. Remember the promise that one of these 12 men would end up buried on the far side of the earth, in a place the fishermen on that shoreline couldn't have named. That's Thomas. According to the tradition preserved by the Thomas Christians of India and acknowledged by church leaders for centuries since, Thomas was killed near a place called Mylapore, on the southeastern coast of India, speared, according to the most common version of the story, while he prayed. His body, tradition holds, was eventually enshrined in a tomb that today sits beneath a cathedral called San Tomé, in the city of Chennai. A cathedral, on the far side of the world, built over the bones of a man who once stood on a beach in Galilee and said, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." And then did exactly that, thousands of miles from home, decades later. Think about a parent watching their child walk out the front door for the very first time, off to school or a job or just down the street to play. You don't know what's coming. You can't know. You just watch them go, and you hope. Now imagine being able to see the whole road ahead: Jerusalem, Rome, Greece, Armenia, Persia, India, every single ending all at once. On the morning you first say, "Follow me," Jesus could see all of it, and he called them anyway. A wet net on a beach, a cathedral on the other side of the world. That's the distance these 12 men traveled, not just in miles, but in what they were willing to lose. So what do you actually take away from 12 lives like this? First, the truth about who these men were. Every single one of the 12 was an ordinary person before Jesus called them. Fishermen with cracked hands and salt in their clothes. A tax collector everyone in town spat at behind his back. A man whose political loyalties made him an enemy of Rome. Jesus didn't build his church on impressive people. He built it on available people. That's the truth about the topic, and it should change how you think about what qualified even means. Second, what that means for you. If Jesus could look at Peter, a man who would deny him 3 times before the week was over, and still hand him the keys to everything that came next, then whatever you think disqualifies you probably doesn't. The men in this video weren't chosen because they had it together. They were chosen, and then they got it together, slowly, painfully, over years, most of them while walking toward their own deaths. If you've been waiting to feel ready before you take whatever step you know you're supposed to take, these 12 men are proof that ready was never the requirement. And third, the one that should sit with you longest. Every one of these 12 men knew, by the end, roughly what it was going to cost them, and not one of them turned back. Not Peter, walking toward a cross in Rome he'd asked to be turned upside down. Not Andrew on a beach in Greece, looking at a cross shaped like an X. Not Thomas, 3,000 miles from the lake where it all started, with a spear in his hand. They had seen the resurrected Jesus with their own eyes, and after that, nothing, not distance, not torture, not death itself, was enough to make them say it wasn't true. So here's my question for you. Out of everything in this video, Peter's upside-down cross, Andrew's X-shaped cross, John alone on Patmos, or Thomas's tomb on the other side of the world, which one of these 12 endings hit you the hardest? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, if you want to keep walking through the Bible with someone who treats it like the most important true story you'll ever hear, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because 2,000 years ago, 12 ordinary men heard 2 words on a beach, and those 2 words changed the world. It started with a wet net on the sand. It ends with cathedrals on every continent, built over the bones of men who were never supposed to matter at all.